Okay, welcome to the final chapter in our book here. Chapter 23, The Woodpile. The brigade arrived in Lachine on a quiet August evening. Once the pelts were delivered to the company warehouse, Pierre shouldered his pack and he headed for home. Just before he turned onto the road that led to his cabin, he approached Dr. Gillard's house. Pierre closed his eyes and he shivered as he recalled the mad dash he made last spring. "LePage! Pierre LePage!" Gillard called out. Pierre looked up, surprised to see the doctor, his wife, and Celeste all sitting in the front porch. "Well, good evening, Doctor," Pierre said, touching his cap. "Is McKay's brigade back already?" Gillard asked. "We just got in this evening, sir." Pierre paused at Gillard's front gate. "Did you have a good trip?" the doctor asked. "Well, yes," Pierre paused, thinking about how impossible it would be to reduce the last 3 months of his life into a single answer. For now, he would leave it simple. "Yes," he repeated. "We had a fine trip." "You must stop by sometime," Mrs. Gillard interjected, "and tell us about your travels." "Well, I'd like that," Pierre said, smiling at Celeste. "Hello, Celeste," he said. Celeste blushed and lowered her eyes before she spoke. He remembered her as bold and self-confident. Yet today, she looked pale and shy. Since Celeste's reply was impossible to hear, Pierre simply smiled. "Nice seeing you folks," he said, "but I really have to get home." "Of course," Dr. Gillard said, but do stop by again." "Thank you, sir. I will." So Pierre heard the axe from a long way off. Even before he got within sight of the cabin, the ringing of the steel told him his father was splitting oak. As he walked up the trail, he recalled the day last spring when he had sprinted down the same path. He balked at the thought that it had happened just last May. He shook his head and he wondered how time could play such tricks. It seemed as if half his life has passed since that day. Just then he heard a bark and his dog. His dog Pepper ran out of the brush. Pierre knelt and greeted his old friend. The whole time he petted the dog, he could still hear the steady ringing of Father's axe. At the edge of the clearing, Pierre laid down his pack. His moccasins were silent as he and Pepper crept toward the cabin to surprise his father. They were screened by a tall pine until they were nearly to the woodshed. But as soon as Pierre tiptoed around the corner of the cabin, his father looked up. Reacting to some small movement or sensing his presence out of instinct, as a woodsman would do, Father looked over his shoulder. The axe was suspended high over his head. In a single motion, he released the blade and pivoted toward his son. Pierre sucked in his breath and closed his eyes tight. He could see the axe slashing into his father's leg. Instead, he heard the solid thunk of wood. And he looked up again. By then, Father was halfway to him. Before Father had a chance to shout, Pierre put his finger to his lips and he shook his head, signaling to keep his arrival a secret. Teary-eyed Father crushed him in a long, silent hug. "Let me have a look at you," Father whispered, stepping back to hold him at arm's length. As they stood eye to eye, Pierre was surprised to see he was nearly as tall as his father. They shook hands, and Father raised his eyebrows when he felt the new strength in Pierre's grip. He grinned like a man who had found a son long given up for dead. Pierre was worried, though, by the strange way his father shook his head from side to side. "Is something wrong?" Pierre asked. But his father just stared. I said, is there something wrong? Father chuckled, saying, well, not something, but everything. What do you mean? Pierre asked. Is Mother all right? Oh, no, nothing like that. Well, what do you mean then? Is it not wrong to send a boy off and have him never come back? I'm back. But you're not the same. Father studied the confusion in his son's face. He concluded finally by saying, no, somewhere along the trail, you buried my boy and resurrected a man in his place. Father was laughing now and giving his son a second hug. Pierre had trouble believing he changed that much, from boy to man. He thought, in a single summer? He looked over his shoulder toward the house to see if anyone had heard the commotion. His father stepped back. Pierre couldn't help staring at the stub of his father's thumb. Stretched tight as it was with skin that looked smoother and shinier than the rest of his hand, Father saw him staring at the injured thumb, and suddenly lifted it level with his son's eyes. Oh, you have nothing to worry about here. Where this little stump is concerned, he said. It healed quick and never slowed me down, even half a lick. Feel it. He paused, tapping the stub on Pierre's shoulder. It works just as good as a regular thumb, and it's tough as a chunk of seasoned cordwood. Still grinning, Father thumped his scarred appendage twice against the front of his own thigh to prove his point. Why don't you take a rest? Pierre asked, nodding in the direction of the woodpile, and let me finish up the splitting. Father frowned. This is no time to chop wood. We've got some serious celebrating to do. Once you step inside the house, Pierre said, I suspect it won't take Mother long to figure out the wood isn't splitting itself. Father nodded then, agreeing it would be a fine joke. So he studied his son's weather-toughened face, while Pierre walked to the woodblock and pulled the axe free with one hand. It felt good to balance the familiar hickory handle in his hands. The dark oiled green was smooth against his calloused palms. As he hefted the axe, Pierre was surprised that it felt no heavier than a paddle blade. He set a block of wood in place and he swung. With the flat crack of a branch snapping off in midwinter cold, the blade sheared the oak block in two. The perfect halves fell onto the packed earth with a thud and rocked for an instant before they were still. Pierre smiled when he saw how deeply the axe head was buried in the chopping block. Then, with a grin that bettered his son's, Father hurried off toward the cabin. That is the end of our story. So I'd like to share this with you if you are interested, and I hope you are. In The Broken Blade, 13-year-old Pierre was seasoned by his first trip as a voyageur, spending the summer of 1800 paddling and portaging a canoe 2,400 miles into the French-Canadian wilderness. Now he's 14. So this is a book that's not necessarily a sequel, because a sequel pretty much carries on where the old story left off. This is more of a companion book, okay? And it's called Wintering. I think you'd like it if you want to give it a chance. If you enjoyed this book, and I hope you did, Broken Blade, I think you'll like Wintering. So, now in this book, Wintering, he's 14. He's not 13, he's 14. And he's ready to become an Evernon, to winter over, trapping and trading furs with a crew in the north. And Evernon faces cold, isolation, and hunger. For Pierre, one of the biggest challenges is spending months in close quarters with Bellois, the teasing bowman. Can you imagine that? The guy that he socked in the stomach. Or socked, was it the stomach or the chest? I forget. Anyway, Benoit, the guy was teasing him the whole trip. Now, in this book, Wintering, he ends up spending a whole winter with him. But an Ojibwe brave welcomes Pierre into his family and opens up a new world as they hunt and explore the woods together. And McHenry, Pierre's commander, offers Pierre his love of books. Wintering proves an invigorating adventure in this companion to the award-winning The Broken Blade, as Pierre earns the Ivernon's rewards, self-reliance, endurance, and the chance to share in the jokes, celebrations, and tragedies of his community. So, if you're interested in Broken Blade, Wintering would be a good book to read. Also, a little author's note here I'd like to share with you. William Durbin, who's the author of this book, was born in Minneapolis, and he lives on Lake Vermilion, at the edge of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northeastern Minnesota, way up on the northern part of the state. He and his wife Barbara have 2 grown children. A former teacher, William Durbin, has published biographies of Tiger Woods and Arnold Palmer, as well as several books for young readers, among them Blackwater Ben, Wintering, Song of Sampo Lake, Elector, and The Winter War. The Broken Blade won the Great Lakes Book Award for children's books and the Minnesota Book Award for young adult fiction. So Mr. Durbin is quite the accomplished author. So I hope you liked this book, The Broken Blade. I really enjoyed reading it to you, and can't wait to see your faces next week in school, and we'll talk about it some more. Thank you very much, boys and girls. Have a good day.